October 15, 1943, the flight deck of the USS Essex, somewhere in the South Pacific. The salt spray driven by the 30-knot wind was a cold, stinging reminder that there was no land in any direction for 1,000 miles. Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Sully O'Brien, 22 years old, stood on the vibrating, windswept steel deck, his flight suit smelling of sweat, oil, and the faint, coppery scent of his own fear. He was staring at his airplane, and he hated it. It wasn't just a plane, it was a monster. A dark blue, 13,000-pound beast of stitched metal and barely controlled rage. Officially, it was the Vought F4U-1 Corsair. The pilots, the men who had to fly it, had other names. They called it the Ensign Eliminator, the Bent-Wing Bastard, or most commonly, the Widowmaker. It was Sully's first combat assignment. He had trained for 2 years to fly the F4F Wildcat, a plane that was chunky, reliable, and forgiving. The Wildcat was like a loyal, ugly farm dog. This thing was a wolf. A wolf that, rumor had it, preferred to eat its own master. "She's a real looker, ain't she, Lieutenant?" The voice was from his crew chief, a grizzled, tobacco-chewing man named Grizz. "She's something," Sully replied, his voice tight. He walked a slow circle around the plane, his boots clanging on the metal deck. The sheer scale of it was wrong. It was a naval fighter, meant to land on this tiny, moving speck of steel, but it was built like a heavy bomber. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was the most powerful piston engine in the world. It was a 2,000 horsepower furnace, and it was attached to the front of a cockpit that seemed like an afterthought. This engine created the first problem, the nose. Because the engine was so massive, the nose was enormous. It stretched out an astonishing 14 feet in front of the pilot. Sully, when he sat in the cockpit, could not see the flight deck. He couldn't see the man waving the signal flags. He had to land a 400 mm missile on a moving postage stamp blind. The engine created the second problem, the propeller. To absorb 2,000 horsepower, it needed a propeller of absurd size. The Hamilton Standard prop on the front was a massive 3-bladed scythe over 13 feet in diameter. And that prop was the source of the plane's most ridiculous, most stupid feature. Sully stopped and stared at the wings. They were bent. It wasn't a graceful curve. It wasn't an elegant sweep. They came out of the fuselage, went down at a sharp, awkward angle, and then cranked back up again. It looked wrong. It looked like a manufacturing defect. It looked like a bird with 2 broken wings. "It's just ugly, Grizz," Sully muttered. Why in God's name is it bent? It's like they built it, crashed it, and then decided to just fly it anyway." Grizz spat a stream of tobacco juice over the side. "That's the trick, Lieutenant, the inverted gull wing. You ask me, it's just plain ugly, but they say it's the only thing that works." This ugly trick was the plane's entire identity. It was a desperate, cobbled-together solution. Sully knew the story. The engineers at Vought had the engine. They had the propeller. But when they tried to attach the 13-foot prop to a normal, straight wing, the prop tips hit the ground. They had a choice. They could either make the landing gear ridiculously, comically long, so long it would snap off during a carrier landing, or they could break the wings. They could bend the wings down, bringing the fuselage closer to the prop, and then attach the landing gear at the lowest point of the gull. It was a brute force, ugly, stupid solution. A farmer's fix. It was an engineer admitting he'd failed and had to hammer the pieces together, and that was just the part you could see. The part you could feel was worse. The 2,000 horsepower engine created so much torque that the plane would try to violently flip itself over on takeoff. A new pilot, an ensign, if he wasn't ready for it, would be rolled into the sea before he even left the deck. If he did get it in the air, the plane's left wing would stall before the right, meaning it would snap roll without warning. And landing was a controlled crash. The tail hook was too short. The landing gear, stiff and unforgiving, would hit the deck and bounce, sending the plane skittering over the crash barrier and into the island. This was the plane the U.S. Navy was counting on. Why? Because of the other plane. The enemy. The Mitsubishi A6M. The Zero. The Zero was a samurai's sword. It was light, fast, and could turn on a dime. The F4F Wildcat was a flying brick. In 1942, the Zero was sweeping the skies of the Pacific, unbeatable, a ghost of white and red. The U.S. Navy was desperate for an answer, a plane that could climb with the Zero and dive with it. So, Vaught's engineers had made a deal with the devil. They had sacrificed everything, safety, pilot visibility, landing characteristics, for one single solitary goal: speed. They had taken the biggest engine in the world and wrapped the smallest, most aerodynamic bent-wing airframe they could around it. This ensign killer was the result. It was a plane that hated the ground. It was a plane that hated its own carrier. It was a plane that only felt alive at 20,000 feet, flying at 425 miles per hour. The loudspeaker crackled. "Pilots, man your planes! Man your planes! First patrol, scramble!" Sully's blood went cold. This was it, his first real mission. He looked at the bent-winged bastard, a machine that had already killed more Americans than the Japanese had, and swung himself up into the cockpit. "Good luck, Lieutenant," Grizz yelled over the rising wind. "Just don't bounce the landing." Sully strapped himself in, the cockpit so far back he felt like he was sitting in the tail. He looked forward. He could see nothing but 14 feet of blue-black engine cowling. He was about to fly a 400mm beast off a moving ship, completely blind, to go fight an enemy he couldn't outturn. And the part of the plane that was supposed to save him was a broken wing. The flight deck of the Essex was a controlled, violent symphony. Men in colored jerseys, yellow for the plane directors, red for the ordnance, ran in a precise, frantic ballet. The air, already thick with salt, became unbreathable, choked with the high-octane stench of aviation fuel and the eye-watering blue-black smoke of 2,000 horsepower engines catching fire. Sully's hand, clammy inside his leather glove, moved over the controls. Magnetos, fuel mixture, prop pitch. He was a 22-year-old kid, but his movements were the precise, memorized motions of a surgeon. One mistake, one forgotten switch, and the double wasp engine would either flood, choke, or tear itself from the wings. "Ready, sir," Grizz's voice yelled from outside, barely audible over the howl of the wind. Sully nodded, though Grizz couldn't see him. He hit the starter. The Corsair did not start. It detonated. The 13-foot propeller vanished into a transparent, shimmering disc. The entire 13,000-pound airframe shook. It didn't vibrate. It felt like a living, caged animal trying to rip itself apart. The noise wasn't an engine. It was a physical assault, a deep-chested, apocalyptic roar that Sully felt in his teeth, his spine, and the pit of his stomach. This was the Ensign Eliminator's first test. The torque. Sully held the brakes with all his strength, his legs trembling. He could feel the plane's left wing, the heavy wing, trying to dip, trying to roll the plane over right there on the deck, pulled by the rotational force of the giant propeller. He was already fighting it, his right foot jamming the rudder pedal to the floor, the stick hard over to the right, just to keep the monster flying straight while it was still parked. The plane director, a man in a yellow jersey, became a blur, his colored flags a frantic, stylized language. He was waving him forward into takeoff position. Sully eased off the brakes. The Corsair lurched, a clumsy, angry beast as he taxied, blind, toward the end of the deck. He wasn't steering, he was herding. He stopped. The flight deck officer, LSO, raised his flag. This was it. 800 feet of moving steel. After that, a 5,000-foot drop to the Pacific. The LSO dropped the flag. Sully's hand slammed the throttle forward to the firewall. The result was instantaneous. The 2,000 horsepower engine hit him in the back like a cannonball. He was pinned to his seat, the G-force so violent he couldn't breathe. The roar became a solid, unbearable wall of sound, and the torque hit. "Rudder! Rudder!" he screamed to himself. The plane, as predicted, tried to violently roll to the left, straight toward the carrier's island. Sully stomped on the right rudder pedal with all his strength, fighting the engine. The plane fishtailed, drunk, skittering toward the edge of the deck. He was flying the engine, not the plane. He was out of deck. The nose, 14 feet in front of him, was pointed at the gray water. He wasn't fast enough. He was going to stall. He was going to die. He hauled back on the stick. The Corsair, its ugly bent wings grabbing the air, did not stall. It leapt. It leapt off the deck, not with grace, but with a savage, brutal, rocket-like power. It was airborne. The second the wheels left the deck, the ensign killer transformed. The clumsy, vibrating, torque-twisting beast was gone. The moment the air was flowing over those strange, inverted gull wings, the plane became perfect. It was stable. It was fast. It was, Sully realized with a jolt of pure, terrified awe, the most beautiful thing he had ever flown. He retracted his landing gear, the gear that fit so perfectly because of the bent wing, and the plane accelerated again. He was climbing at 4,000 feet per minute. He was a projectile. His squadron formed up around him, 4 dark blue, bent-winged shapes against the clouds. Below them, the Essex was already just a gray speck, a memory. This was the paradox of the Corsair. It was a plane that had been built to solve one problem, how to make the biggest engine in the world fly. That single-minded, stupid focus on harnessing that engine had created a dozen other problems: the torque, the stall, the bounce, the visibility. It was a death trap on takeoff and a death trap on landing. But here, in the air, in its element, it was a god. They climbed to 25,000 feet. The patrol. For 2 hours, they were just specks in an endless, empty, blue-white world. The only sound was the steady, deep-chested thrum of the double wasp, a sound that was no longer angry but almost content. Sully's fear began to fade, replaced by a cold, focused boredom. Then, the radio crackled. The voice of his squadron leader, Commander Smoke Jensen. "Bandits, 4 o'clock high. Tally-ho!" Sully's blood went hot. He snapped his head to the right. He saw them, 6 of them. 6 small, white, graceful specks diving out of the sun. Zeros. They looked graceful. They looked like birds. They fell through the sky with an elegance that made Sully's Corsair feel like a flying anvil. "Brake! Brake right!" Smoke ordered. Sully slammed his stick to the right, the G-force stapling him to his seat. The Zeros, masters of the sky, were on them in seconds. They didn't have the Corsair's brute power, but they had agility. One of them, painted with a blood-red tail, flashed past Sully's canopy. The Japanese pilot, so close Sully could see the white scarf around his neck, snap-rolled his Zero and in a single fluid, impossible motion, was instantly on Sully's tail. The radio erupted in a cacophony of screams, machine gun fire, and tactical chatter. "I've got one on me. He's on my 6. He's turning inside me." Sully was now in the one fight he could not win. A turning fight. The Zero was behind him, and it was gaining. Tracer, orange-red lines like angry wasps, streamed past his left wing. The Japanese pilot was finding his range. Sully hauled back on the stick, trying to outturn him, but it was useless. The Corsair, heavy with its engine and armor, was a dump truck. The Zero was a ballet dancer. The enemy was closing. "Don't turn, Sully, don't turn," Smoke's voice screamed in his ear. "You're not in a Wildcat. Climb." Sully was in a panic. He was hauling back, the plane shuddering on the edge of a stall. The Zero was right there, his cannons winking. Climb. It was the stupid solution. It was the only one he had. Sully stopped trying to turn. He pointed the massive 14-foot nose of the Corsair straight at the sun and pushed the throttle. He unleashed the Wasp. The Corsair, the plane that had been built for this one moment, answered. The 2,000 horsepower engine, the engine that made takeoffs a nightmare, now became his savior. The plane didn't just climb. It accelerated, vertically. Sully was pinned to his seat, his vision graying out. 26,000 feet, 27,000, 28,000. The Japanese pilot in his lightweight 900 horsepower Zero was stunned. He tried to follow. He couldn't. His plane, the king of the dogfight, gasped in the thin air, its engine choking. It was like a race car trying to follow a rocket ship up a cliff face. Sully kept climbing. 30,000 feet. He was safe. He looked down. The Zero, its stupid prey having just vanished, was now stalled, hanging helplessly in the air, its engine sputtering. Sully O'Brien, the rookie, the terrified ensign, rolled his bent-wing bastard over into a dive. The ugly trick, the bent wings that held the giant engine, had just worked. The sky, for a single, breathless moment, was silent. Sully hung weightless at the apex of his climb, 30,000 feet above the Pacific. He had done the impossible. He had outclimbed a Zero. But the battle wasn't over. It had just changed. He looked down. Far below him, a small white speck, the Japanese ace, was just now recovering from his failed climb. The Zero, built for agility, not power, had stalled out, a helpless, fluttering leaf. The pilot was a master. He was already in a tight spin, recovering, leveling off at 25,000 feet. Sully, however, was 5,000 feet above him. He now possessed the single most valuable commodity in air combat: altitude. Altitude was potential energy. It was a stored weapon. "Sully, you've got him," Smoke Jensen's voice crackled in his ear. "Don't follow him down. Don't turn. Boom and zoom. Use the speed." Boom and zoom. It was the new tactic, a brutal, almost un-American style of fighting that the Corsair's design had forced upon them. The Wildcat was a brawler. You got in a phone booth and punched. The Corsair was a jousting weapon. You used its massive weight and that stupid 2,000 horsepower engine to hit the enemy at speeds they couldn't even comprehend. Sully O'Brien, the kid who had been paralyzed by fear just 2 minutes earlier, now felt a cold, clear, predatory calm settle over him. He was no longer the prey. He was the hammer, and the Zero was the nail. He rolled the Corsair over, its ugly bent wings catching the thin air, and pointed the massive 14-foot nose straight down. If the climb had been a rocket, the dive was a thunderbolt. The Corsair, with its heavy engine, its dense airframe, and its revolutionary aerodynamic bent wings, did not accelerate smoothly. It plummeted. It was a 13,000-pound anvil dropped from the roof of the sky. The altimeter needle began to spin. 29,000. 28,000. 27,000. The airspeed indicator, which had been hovering around 150 mph at the top of his climb, now jumped. 300, 350, 400, 450, 500 miles per hour. The airframe, which had felt so clumsy on the carrier deck, now screamed. The wind, rushing over the unique shape of the gull wings and the oil cooler intakes, created a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. It was a sound that would become a legend, a sound the Japanese would soon call the whistling death. To Sully, it was the sound of a beast unleashed. The Japanese pilot, far below, heard it. He must have. He snapped his Zero into a frantic climbing turn, trying to see the demon that was falling on him. But the Corsair was too fast. It was closing the distance at a rate of 700 feet per second. Sully's world narrowed to the glowing yellow pipper of his gun sight. The Zero, once a graceful bird, was now just a white X, swelling rapidly to fill his view. He did not aim. He did not dogfight. He simply pointed the entire 7-ton mass of his airplane at the target. The Zero, still trying to turn, filled the crosshairs. Now. Sully squeezed the trigger. The Corsair was not just a giant engine, it was a giant gun. 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, erupted in a single devastating concussive roar. This was not the polite pop, pop, pop of the Zero's smaller cannons. This was a wall of lead, a storm of 4,500 rounds per minute, a stream of armor-piercing, incendiary bullets that hit the Japanese plane with the force of a tidal wave. The Zero did not burn. It did not trail smoke. It disintegrated. One moment, it was a plane. The next, it was a cloud of white and red confetti. The armor-piercing rounds shredded the lightweight, unarmored airframe. The incendiaries detonated the fuel tank. The entire aircraft vanished in a flash of orange-black fire, its pieces scattering in the wind. Sully didn't even have time to react. His 500 mm dive carried him through the debris cloud. A thump and a smear of oil hit his canopy as a piece of his victim struck his plane. He hauled back on the stick, the G-forces slamming him down into his seat, his vision going gray at the edges. He leveled off at 20,000 feet. He was alone. He was alive. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the stick. "Scratch one," Smoke's voice yelled. "Good kill, Sully. Good kill. Now climb. Get your altitude back. Do not turn." Sully understood. He looked down. The rest of the dogfight was a swirling chaos of contrails, but it was a different kind of fight. The other Zeros, having seen their leader vaporized, were panicked. Their primary weapon, their agility, was useless. If they turned, the Corsairs just left, climbing away at an impossible angle. If they stayed and fought, the Corsairs would dive on them, using their whistling death shriek to announce an execution they could not escape. The bent-wing bastard had just rewritten the rules of air combat. The ugly flaw, the bent wing, was the very thing that allowed the massive engine and prop to be mounted. And that engine was everything. It was armor, it was speed, it was life. The Japanese pilots, who had ruled the Pacific for 2 years, were suddenly, hopelessly outmatched by a plane that looked like it had been broken before it even left the factory. "Patrol complete," Smoke finally ordered, his voice calm but with an edge of triumph. "RTB, back to the barn, boys. Let's go home." Sully's heart, which had been hammering with combat adrenaline, now sank into a new, cold dread. The fight was over. Now came the hard part. He had to land the Widowmaker. The flight back to the Essex was a 20-minute eternity. The adrenaline of the dogfight, the pure, searing joy of the 500 mm dive, had evaporated. All that was left was a cold, acidic knot in Sully's stomach. He had survived the Zeros. Now he had to survive his own airplane. The radio crackled. "Okay, boys," Smoke Jensen's voice said, calm as ever. "We're home. Let's get him on the deck. Standard landing pattern. Sully, you're last in the break. Take your time. Don't think about it. Just fly the paddles." "Roger, Smoke," Sully said, but his voice was a dry croak. "Don't think about it." That was like telling a man not to think about the 5,000-foot drop just beneath his feet. He watched from 2,000 feet as the rest of his squadron broke formation and began their landing approaches. One by one, the bent-winged shapes descended toward the gray speck of the carrier. He watched Smoke's plane hit the deck, catch a wire, and slam to a halt. Good landing. The next one bounced. Sully's heart seized. The plane bounced, missed the wire, but the pilot firewalled the engine and took off again. A bolter? Safe? But now he'd have to try again. Now it was Sully's turn. He descended, dropping his gear and flaps. The Corsair, the high-speed god, instantly became the ensign killer again. It became sluggish, heavy, and angry. It hated flying slow. He lined up with the carrier's wake, a white scar on the dark blue water. The Essex was steaming at 30 knots into the wind, creating a 60-knot gale over the flight deck. He was trying to land on a moving, pitching, 800-foot-long target. And he was blind. As he lowered the plane's tail for the landing attitude, the 14-foot-long double wasp engine, that monster that had saved him, now betrayed him. The nose rose up, completely obliterating his view. He couldn't see the deck. He couldn't see the ship. He couldn't see anything except a patch of gray sky and the 14 feet of metal cowling in front of him. His entire life, his $50,000 airplane, and the lives of the deck crew all depended on one man, a tiny figure standing on a small platform on the port side of the ship, holding two colored paddles. The landing signal officer. Paddles. Bartholomew. Paddles was his eyes. Sully's job was to not fly the plane. His job was to fly the paddles. "Okay, Sully," he whispered to himself, his hands choking the stick. "Don't look at the water. Don't look at the ship. Watch. The man." He was 100 feet above the water, 800 yards out. He saw the paddles. They were steady. "You're good. You're on glide slope." He fought the plane. The Corsair, riding the edge of a stall, wanted to dip its left wing. He fed it right rudder, fighting the torque. Paddles. They were still steady. He was 50 feet above the churning white foam of the ship's wake. He was going to hit the back of the ship, the fantail. He was too low. His hand instinctively went to pull back. Paddles. They were rising. "You're low. Add power." Sully's hand, slick with sweat, jammed the throttle forward a fraction. The Wasp roared. The plane jumped. Paddles. They were dropping. "Too high. Cut power." He eased the throttle. He was a puppet on a string, and Paddles was the master. He was 20 feet from the deck. He was still blind. He saw the paddles cross. The cut signal. The most terrifying signal in naval aviation. It meant, "Stop flying. Now." Sully's training took over. He chopped the throttle. He cut the power completely. The 7-ton Corsair, its wings instantly starved of lift, dropped the last 15 feet like a boulder. Wham! The impact was not a landing. It was a crash. The stiff, unforgiving landing gear hit the steel deck with a force that sent a shockwave through Sully's spine, snapping his head forward. But he wasn't done. The Corsair was infamous for bouncing. The plane hit, and just as the tailhook was about to catch the number 3 wire, the stiff gear rebounded. The plane, in a single, sickening, slow-motion lurch, bounced 3 feet back into the air. The tailhook, perfectly aimed, jumped clean over the arresting wire. And the next one, and the next. Miss, miss, miss. Sully was no longer landing. He was rolling. He was an 80 mm 7-ton missile, unhooked, and he was rolling straight at the crash barrier, a simple steel net designed to stop a 4,000-pound Wildcat, not a 13,000-pound Corsair. Beyond the barrier were the planes from the first patrol, their pilots still in them. He was about to kill them all. He had less than a second. He did not hit the brakes. Brakes wouldn't stop him. He did not pray. He reacted. His hand, which had just cut the power, slammed the throttle back to the firewall. Now. The 2,000-horsepower double Wasp engine, the ensign killer, the bent-wing bastard's heart, detonated. It went from a 700 RPM idle to a 2,000 to 700 RPM scream in 1 second. Brrrr. The torque hit. The plane tried to flip over onto the deck. Sully stomped the rudder. The plane, which had been rolling, leapt. The ugly, stupid bent wings, now blasted with the 100 mm prop wash from that monster engine, grabbed the air. Sully O'Brien, still blind, pulled back on the stick. He didn't see the barrier. He felt it. A scrape. A screech of metal as his tailhook, useless for catching a wire, snagged the top of the barrier net, ripping it from its stanchions. He was airborne. He cleared the deck, missing the parked planes by inches, his whistling death shriek now a sound of pure, desperate animal panic. He was alive. He was flying. And his fuel gauge was ticking toward E. He had to go all the way around. And do it again. Sully O'Brien's knuckles were white. He was a 22-year-old man, but he felt 100. He had just lived an entire lifetime in the 30 seconds it took to bounce, miss 3 wires, and hurtle his 7-ton fighter over the crash barrier, missing his friends by the thickness of a coat of paint. His heart was hammering a wild, sick rhythm against his ribs. His flight suit, which had been damp, was now completely soaked in a cold, stinging sweat. "Sully, you lucky bastard," Smoke Jensen's voice crackled, trying to sound calm, but the relief in it was palpable. "You just used up a year's worth of luck. Now get your gear up, clear the deck, and get back in the pattern. And this time, Sully, plant that goddamn thing." "Roger, Smoke," Sully breathed, his voice a reedy, unfamiliar squeak. He was flying, but his hands were shaking so badly the control stick was visibly wobbling. Plant it, as if it were that simple, as if he were landing a Piper Cub in a grass field, not a 13,000-pound beast of torque on a moving ship. He looked at his fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above the red. He had one more try. This was it. There was no bolter next time. If he missed the wires again, he would not have enough fuel to go around. He would have to ditch it in the ocean, a maneuver that in the Corsair was famously lethal. The massive engine would pull the plane straight to the bottom like an anchor, and the cockpit, set 14 feet back, would fill with water before he could unbuckle. This was the devil's bargain of the Corsair. It could kill any Zero in the sky, but it was just as likely to kill you on the way home. He fell back into the landing pattern, a dark blue shape circling the gray ship. He was last, again. The deck crew, who he had nearly decapitated, had reset the barrier in a frantic 10-minute rush. They were ready for him. He lowered his gear and flaps. The plane, as before, became a heavy, wallowing pig. He lined up with the ship's wake. He was blind again. All he could see was 14 feet of blue cowling in the gray, indifferent sky. Watch the paddles. Just the paddles. His entire universe shrank to the tiny, yellow-clad figure of the landing signal officer. Paddles was steady. You're good. He was 100 feet out. The deck was pitching, a slight, sickening starboard roll. Paddles. They were rising. Add power. Add power. Sully tapped the throttle. The Wasp roared. The torque tried to twist him. He fought it with his rudder. Paddles. They were steadying. He was over the fantail. He could hear the whistle of the wind over the deck. Paddles. They were crossing. The cut signal. This time, Sully didn't just cut the throttle, he killed it. He yanked it back so hard his knuckles hit the bulkhead. He did not fly the plane onto the deck. He stalled it. He dropped it the last 10 feet, letting gravity do the work. Wham! The impact was even worse than the first. It was a bone-shattering, tooth-rattling crash. The plane hit the steel deck so hard that Sully's head snapped forward, his helmet cracking against the illuminated glass of the gun sight. Stars exploded behind his eyes. He felt the tailhook grab. It was a feeling like nothing else on Earth. A sudden, violent, immediate deceleration that slammed him forward into his straps, the G-force trying to rip him from his seat. The Corsair, which had been an 80-mile missile, was now at a dead stop. In 40 feet. He was caught. He was safe. The deck crew, the red shirts, were already running toward him, even as the plane's propeller was still windmilling. For a full 10 seconds, Sully just sat there, his entire body trembling in a violent, uncontrollable spasm. He couldn't move. He couldn't unclench his hands from the stick. He was alive. Grizz, his crew chief, was the first one to jump onto the wing. He ripped the canopy open. "Lieutenant, Sully, you all right?" Sully looked up, his eyes unfocused. He finally unstrapped his helmet, his hair plastered to his head with sweat. He tried to say something, but only a choked half-laugh came out. I bounced," he finally managed to say. Grizz looked back at the deck, at the mangled, torn-down crash barrier from the first attempt. Then he looked at Sully, who was white as a sheet. "Bounce?" Grizz said, a slow grin spreading across his leathery face. "Lieutenant, you didn't bounce. You damn near demolished the island. But that second landing, that wasn't a landing, son. That was a controlled car crash. But you caught a wire. You're home." Grizz slapped the side of the cockpit. "You hate her, don't you?" Sully, still trembling, looked at the instrument panel. I've never been so scared in my entire life, Grizz. This thing, it tried to kill me. 3 different times." "I know," Grizz said, his voice quiet now. "She's a widowmaker, just like they say. A real bent-winged bastard." He looked over his shoulder at the deck, where the other pilots were climbing out of their Corsairs, all of them buzzing, all of them alive. "But did you see Smoke's report? We got 6. 6 zeros, no losses. The Wildcats, they'd have been lucky to get one, and we'd have lost too. This thing, it's a killer." That was the bargain. The truth. The U.S. Navy, in fact, was so terrified of the Corsair's landing characteristics that they had already made a decision. They had rejected it. They had deemed the F4U Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations. It was too dangerous. Too many ensigns were dying just trying to land it. The Navy, in its wisdom, had decided to give their Widowmaker away. They took their entire order of the fastest, most powerful, most lethal fighter plane in the world, and gave it to the Marines. The Marines, who were fighting a desperate, bloody ground-pounders war from tiny, half-finished dirt and coral airstrips on islands like Guadalcanal and Vella La Vella, did not care about tailhooks. They didn't care about bouncing. They didn't care about torque. They just wanted a plane that could climb out of a muddy field and kill Zeros. And the ensign killer, the bent-wing bastard, the plane that was too dangerous for the Navy, was about to find its true home. February 14th, 1944, Vella La Vella, Solomon Islands. The airstrip was not an airstrip. It was a 3,000-foot-long strip of mud, crushed coral, and rusting steel mats laid over a literal swamp. It had been carved out of the humid, rotting, 110-degree jungle by the U.S. Navy's Seabees, their construction battalions, just weeks earlier, while they were still under fire from Japanese snipers. This was not the Essex. This was Henderson Field, a name given to a dozen different patches of hell across the Pacific, and this was the new home of the Vought F4U Corsair. The U.S. Marines, VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, were not naval aviators. They were mud fighters. Their commander, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, was a 31-year-old grandpa, hence the nickname, who was by all accounts a brawling, hard-drinking, insubordinate genius. And he loved the Corsair. He loved it precisely because the Navy hated it. The Navy saw its flaws. Pappy saw its strengths. He stood on an upturned fuel drum, the humid air thick with the stench of diesel, mold, and unburied corpses. His pilots were a collection of rejects, replacements, and unassigned men, a bunch of bastards just like their planes. "All right, you sheep," Pappy's voice cut through the jungle humidity. "Listen up. You're all scared of this plane. You've all heard the stories. The Navy says it's a widowmaker. They say it'll kill you on takeoff and kill you on landing." He gestured to the line of dark blue bent-winged beasts, their massive propellers caked in mud, their fuselages streaked with coral dust. "Well, they're right," he yelled. "This plane will try to kill you. It has a 2,000 horsepower engine that wants to flip you into the trees. It has a stall that'll snap you into a spin. It has a nose so long you can't see the man in front of you. This is the most ill-tempered, vicious, unforgiving bastard of an airplane ever built by man." A nervous quiet fell over the young, sweat-soaked pilots. "But up there," Pappy continued, his voice dropping, a predatory grin spreading across his face, "up where the Zeros live, this plane is a god. The Zero is a papier-mâché samurai sword. This is a sledgehammer. You don't turn with him. You don't dance with him. You hit him. You use that stupid engine to climb above him, and you use those ugly wings to dive through him." He pointed at the sky. "The Navy gave us their rejected toy. They gave us the plane they were too scared to fly. And we are going to use it to wipe the Japanese Empire out of the sky. Forget the carrier. Forget the bounce. Just fly the hammer. Dismissed." This was the Corsair's true birth, not on a carrier, but in the mud. For pilots like Sully O'Brien, who after his incident on the Essex had been gratefully transferred to the Marines, this was a revelation. He didn't have to land on an 800-foot moving target. He just had to get it down on a 3,000-foot strip of mud. The ensign killer myth vanished overnight. The pilot still had to fight the torque on takeoff, stomping the rudder to keep from careening into the jungle. But the blind landing, it was no longer a problem. Pappy taught them a new trick, another stupid farmer's solution. "You're blind," he'd said, "so don't look forward. Look sideways." They learned to land the Corsair in a permanent skidding turn. They would fly the plane at a 30-degree angle to the runway, their left wing dipped, crabbing their way down. This allowed them to look around the 14-foot nose and see the runway out the side of their canopy all the way until their wheels touched the mud. It was an ugly, inefficient, dangerous way to land a plane, and it worked. It worked every single time. The Marines, based on these muddy, forward-deployed island strips, were now in the perfect position. They were closer to the fight. They were the fire brigade, the first line of defense and the first to attack. And the Japanese, who had for 2 years ruled the skies over these islands, were suddenly, inexplicably, losing. A typical patrol, February 1944. A flight of 16 Zeros on a fighter sweep spots what they think is an easy kill. A squadron of 8 Corsairs flying below them. The Japanese pilots, confident, dive down, preparing to get into the turning fight they always win. But the Corsairs don't scatter. They don't try to turn. They climb. They point their massive, ugly, double-wasp noses at the sky and unleash the 2,000 horsepower. The Zeros, in their lightweight 900 HP planes, are stunned. The Americans climb past them, through their formation, and are 3,000 feet above them in less than a minute. The whistling death has just taken the high ground. Now the battle is over before it begins. The Corsairs, using Pappy's boom and zoom hammer tactic, roll over and dive. The sound of their shriek echoes across the sky, a banshee's wail that paralyzes the Japanese pilots. The 8 Corsairs dive through the 16 Zeros, a 10-second pass. Boom, 6 50 calibers. Boom, 6 50 calibers. In 30 seconds, 4 Zeros are gone, vaporized by the sheer, brutal kinetic energy of the 7-ton American planes. The remaining Zeros, panicked, break and run. The Corsairs don't even bother to chase them. They just climb. They climb back up to 30,000 feet, their home, and wait for the next victim. The statistics were not just good, they were impossible. The kill ratio, which had been a tragic 1-to-1 with the Wildcat, ballooned. 5-to-1, 8-to-1. By the end of the war, the F4U Corsair, the bent-wing bastard, the stupid, ugly, broken plane that the Navy gave away, had achieved a kill ratio of 11-to-1. It was the most lethal, dominant fighter plane in the entire Pacific theater. That ugly bent wing, that farmer's fix by the engineers at Vaut, had been the trick. It was the only way to fit the giant prop. The giant prop was the only way to absorb the giant engine, and the giant engine was the only thing that could climb. The plane that was designed to solve one simple, stupid engineering problem had, by accident, become the perfect killing machine. April 7th, 1945, 20,000 feet over the East China Sea. Sully O'Brien wasn't a junior-grade lieutenant anymore. He was a captain in the Marines, his face aged 10 years by the Pacific sun, his eyes narrowed by the permanent 1,000-yard stare of a veteran. He was no longer flying from a muddy strip on Vella La Vella. He was flying from the steel deck of the USS Essex. In one of the great, quiet ironies of the war, the U.S. Navy had taken the Corsair back. After the Marines, the mud fighters had spent a year proving that the bent-wing bastard was in fact the most dominant fighter in the sky. The Navy had sheepishly, quietly retrained its own pilots. They had learned the Marines' stupid tricks, the skidding sideways landing, the respect for the massive torque-happy engine, and now the Widowmaker was the premier fighter on every carrier in the fleet. But today, Sully wasn't fighting Zeros. He was hunting something new, something far more terrifying. This was Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, and the Japanese, desperate, cornered, and fanatical, had unleashed their final, most horrific weapon, the kamikaze, the divine wind. Sully and his squadron were on combat air patrol, a steel wall in the sky, positioned between the Japanese mainland and the 1-200 ships of the American invasion fleet. His job was no longer to dogfight. His job was to intercept. The radio, which had been silent for an hour, suddenly burst into a static-laced scream from the ship's combat information center. Tally-ho, bandits, Angels 2-0, bearing 310, 200, repeat, 200 planes, inbound. Sully's blood went cold. Not bandits. Kamikazes. 200 of them. A massive, suicidal wave of Zeros, Vals, and Bettys, planes loaded with 500-pound bombs, their pilots locked on a one-way mission to crash into the American carriers. "Smoke, you see 'em?" Sully called to his leader. "I see 'em, Sully," Jensen's voice replied, grim. "It's the whole damn sky. Okay, boys, this isn't a dogfight. This is extermination. No turns, no fancy stuff. Boom and zoom. Hit them high, hit them hard, and get back up. Don't let one get through, for God's sake. Do not let them through." Sully pointed his Corsair's nose at the oncoming swarm. This was the fight the plane was built for. It wasn't about agility, it was about speed. It was about getting one pass, one kill, and climbing back to altitude before the target even knew what hit it. The sky in front of him, which had been empty, was now a cloud of dark, angry specks. The Japanese pilots saw the Corsairs, but they did not engage. They did not turn. They just dove. They dove past Sully's squadron, heading straight for the ships on the water. This was a race, a 20,000-foot, 400-mile race to the death. "I'm on one," Sully yelled, rolling his Corsair onto its back and pulling the stick into a vertical 500-maf dive. His target was a Betty, a Japanese medium bomber, lumbering, heavy with its bomb. Its pilot focused only on the carrier Essex shimmering on the water below. Sully was diving. The shriek of his whistling death filled the air. 15,000 feet, 10,000. He was closing at an insane, ungodly speed. The Betty in his gun sight swelled from a fly to a bat to an airplane. The Japanese rear gunner, a 17-year-old kid, saw him. He opened up, a stream of green 20mm tracer fire reaching up, trying to swat the diving demon. Sully didn't jink, he didn't move. He held the dive, he held the trigger. The 650 caliber guns roared, a torrent of lead that converged on the bomber's right engine. The engine didn't just smoke, it disintegrated. It tore itself from the wing. The Betty, its right wing gone, cartwheeled into a fireball. Sully hauled back on the stick, the G-force blacking out his vision, and climbed. He used the speed from his dive to rocket back up to 20,000 feet, his home, while the shrapnel from his kill rained into the sea. He looked around. The sky was a swirling, desperate melee, but it was a one-sided slaughter. The Corsairs were too fast. The kamikazes, slow, heavy, and flown by half-trained pilots, were being vaporized. The bent-wing bastards, the planes the Navy had rejected, were now saving the fleet, acting as the 425 McClander of S.H.I.E.L.D. The story of the F4U Corsair is the story of a stupid idea. It's the story of an engineer faced with an impossible problem, a propeller that was too big, who didn't compromise. He didn't make the engine smaller, he didn't make the prop shorter. He broke the wings. He took the most obvious, ugly, and incorrect solution, and in doing so, he accidentally created a legend. That bent wing was not a flaw. It was the key. It was the only way to harness the most powerful engine in the world. And that engine won the war. We're often told to follow the rules, to find the elegant solution, to fit in. But the Corsair teaches us something else. It teaches us that sometimes the ugly solution, the brute force trick, the stupid idea that just barely works, is the one that changes everything. The Japanese didn't fear the Corsair because it was pretty. They feared it because it was wrong. It was a 7-ton, 2,000 horsepower hammer in a sky full of scalpels. So here's my question to you. What's the biggest bent wing in your life? What ugly solution, what stupid trick that everyone else laughs at might just be the key to your own monster-like success? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.